Welcome to Domain 5. We are leaving the firewalls and the packet captures behind. We are going upstairs to the conference rooms, the policy binders, and the people who decide what every engineer downstairs is allowed to do. This is the domain that sounds boring on paper and bites everyone who skips it on the exam. Objective 5.1. Effective security governance. Picture this. Midsize insurance company. The auditor walks in for the annual review. He asks one question. Who owns the data classification policy? 3 people in the room. Nobody answers. The CISO points at the legal team. Legal points at the CIO. The CIO points at compliance. Compliance points back at the CISO. 40 minutes later, somebody finds the policy in a SharePoint folder owned by a director who left the company 18 months prior. The policy was technically enforced the entire time. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had reviewed it. Nobody could even tell you which version was current. That is what bad governance looks like. Controls on paper, nothing in operation, and a finding waiting to happen. Today we fix that. Let me start with the definition because the exam will phrase it precisely. Security governance is the framework of policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines that an organization uses to manage and direct its security posture. 4 words there. Policies, standards, procedures, guidelines. Those 4 are the document hierarchy, and the exam loves this question. Policy is the highest layer, a mandatory statement of intent signed by senior management. Policy answers what and why. Example, all data must be encrypted at rest. That is policy. Standards live underneath. Standards translate the policy into specific measurable requirements. The standard for that policy says AES 256 is required for all stored data. Standards answer how much and how many. Procedures live 1 layer down. Procedures are step-by-step instructions. Run the BitLocker wizard. Record the recovery key in the vault. That is procedure. Procedures answer how. And then at the bottom, guidelines, recommendations, best practices. Should, not shall. Here is the trap. 3 of those 4 are mandatory. Policies, standards, procedures, all required, all enforceable. Violate them and there are consequences. Guidelines are the only optional tier. They cannot be enforced. You cannot discipline somebody for ignoring a guideline. The phrase to remember is should versus shall. Guidelines say should. Everything above guidelines says shall. The exam will hand you a scenario, quote, employees should consider using a password manager, unquote, and ask you which document tier this is. The word should is the giveaway, guideline. The exam will also flip the wording, quote, employees must use a 12-character password, unquote, and ask the same question. The word must is the giveaway. That is either policy or standard depending on whether the requirement is general or specific. 12 characters is specific, standard. Now policies. The information security policy is the umbrella, the high-level statement that everything else hangs from. Every organization has one, or should. Underneath that, you have a stack of more specific policies. The Acceptable Use Policy, AUP, governs what employees can and cannot do with company assets. Internet, email, devices, cloud tools. Permitted uses, prohibited uses, the monitoring notice that tells you the company can read your traffic, and the disciplinary clause. Employees sign the AUP at onboarding, and most companies require annual re-acknowledgement. If you have ever clicked through a corporate workstation login banner, you have acknowledged an AUP. Then there is the Business Continuity Policy, keeps critical functions running during a disruption, and the Disaster Recovery Policy covers IT systems recovery after the disaster has already happened. Different policies, different scopes, frequently confused. BCP is the broader business view. DR is the IT view. Then Incident Response Policy, how to detect, respond to, and recover from incidents, reporting chain, severity levels, legal and regulatory notification timelines. Then Change Management Policy, how changes get reviewed, approved, tested, and rolled back. Then SDLC Policy, for security baked into software development, not bolted on at deployment. Code review requirements, security testing gates, release approval. Each one is a board-approved high-level statement. The exam expects you to recognize what each policy covers when given a scenario. Standards turn that policy language into something an engineer can actually implement. A password standard says minimum 12 characters, mixed case and number and symbol, 90-day expiry, no reuse of the last 10. An access control standard says role-based access, least privilege, quarterly access reviews. A physical security standard says man-trap at the data center entrance, badge readers everywhere, CCTV retention 90 days. An encryption standard says AES 256 at rest, TLS 1.3 in transit, RSA 2048 minimum for key exchange. Standards are mandatory and specific. Standards reference external frameworks, NIST SP 800-63 for passwords, PCI-DSS for cardholder environments, and standards get updated more often than policies because technology changes faster than management language. Procedures are the runbook. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. Change management procedure. Request the change. Run impact analysis. Submit to the CAB, the Change Advisory Board. Get approval. Implement. Validate. Document. Onboarding procedure. Create the accounts. Issue the equipment. Have the new hire sign the AUP. Complete security training. Assign role-based access. Offboarding procedure. Disable the accounts. Revoke access. Recover the laptop. Preserve the email per retention. Procedures exist, so the same task gets done the same way every time, regardless of who is on shift. And here is one the exam wants you to know. Playbooks. A playbook is a procedure specific to incident response. The ransomware playbook, the phishing playbook, the DLP alert playbook. When the alarm goes off at 3 in the morning, the on-call engineer should not be improvising. They should be following the playbook. Guidelines deserve a sentence of their own. Guidelines say should, not shall. They provide flexibility. They are used when a one-size-fits-all mandatory rule would be too restrictive. They guide implementation decisions where multiple valid approaches exist, and they cannot enforce accountability. If somebody violates a guideline, the company has nothing to discipline them with. The exam will phrase a scenario where a manager wants to discipline an employee for ignoring a quote guideline unquote. The right answer is, you cannot. Guidelines are advisory. If you wanted to enforce it, you should have written it as a policy or standard. Now rank the major frameworks because the exam expects you to know what each one is for. Number 1, NIST CSF. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework. 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, free, voluntary, used by U.S. federal agencies and adopted by enterprises worldwide as a maturity model. Number 2, ISO 27001, international certifiable, audited, paid. If you sell into Europe or to security-conscious enterprises, the customer will ask for your ISO 27001 certificate. Number 3, CIS Controls, 18 prioritized controls, tactical, prescriptive, fastest to operationalize. The right answer for a small team that needs to know which control to ship first. Number 4, COBIT. Heavier IT governance framework focused on enterprise alignment, common in audit and finance shops. The exam loves to ask which framework is best for a given context. The shortcut, NIST. CSF is the broad maturity model. ISO 27001 is the certifiable global standard. CIS Controls is the prescriptive starter pack. COBIT is the audit and finance framework. Frameworks are not the only external driver. There are 6 categories of consideration baked into the exam. Regulatory, HIPAA, PCI-DSS, SOX, FERPA, GLBA. Legal key, contracts, NDAs, intellectual property, civil liability. Industry standards, ISO 27001, NIST CSF, CIS Controls. Local and regional, state breach notification laws, CCPA in California, national, FISMA for U.S. federal agencies, global, GDPR, which applies to any organization on Earth that processes EU residents' personal data. That last one trips everybody up. GDPR is not just a European problem. If you sell to EU customers from a server farm in Ohio, GDPR applies. And here is the rule above all the rules. Regulatory beats internal. If your internal policy and HIPAA conflict, HIPAA wins. Always. Anyone who has tried to write an internal policy that quietly contradicted a regulation knows this. The regulator does not care what your handbook says. Now the structures. Centralized governance. One authority makes every decision. Consistent. Slower. Less flexible for individual business units. Decentralized governance. Each business unit owns its own program. Faster, more local, more risk of inconsistency and gaps. Most real organizations land somewhere in between, with a federated model. Above all of it sits the board of directors, ultimate accountability, sets the risk appetite, sets the tone at the top. The Security Steering Committee is the cross-functional group that translates board direction into strategy. The Change Advisory Board, CAB, is the structure for change management. And government entities, the OCC, the FTC, HHS, OCR, the SEC, sit outside the organization and enforce compliance whether you like it or not. The exam will also ask about the CAB specifically. It is the body that reviews and approves proposed changes to IT systems. Pros: reduces change-related risk by forcing review before deployment. Cons: can slow deployment velocity. Most modern shops use a tiered CAB model. Standard pre-approved changes do not need CAB review. Normal changes go through the weekly CAB meeting. Emergency changes can be approved by a single member with after-the-fact ratification. If you have ever sat through a Wednesday morning CAB and watched somebody try to push a database schema change through with no rollback plan, you understand why CAB exists. Roles. This is where the exam writes scenario questions and watches candidates pick the wrong answer. 5 roles to memorize. Data owner, data custodian, sometimes called data steward, data controller, data processor, data subject. The data owner is a senior business leader, accountable for the data, decides classification, decides who gets access. The owner is not in IT. The data custodian is the IT person who implements the controls the owner specified. Owners are accountable. Custodians are responsible. Memorize that distinction. Owner accountable, custodian responsible. The trap on the exam is the candidate who picks the database administrator as the data owner. Wrong. The DBA is the custodian. The owner is the VP of the business unit whose data lives in that database. Then the GDPR specific roles. Data controller decides why and how personal data is processed. That is the organization that collects the data. Data processor processes data on behalf of the controller, your cloud provider, your payroll vendor, your marketing automation platform. The controller decides the purpose, the processor just executes. And the data subject is the individual person whose data is being processed. The customer, the employee, the patient. Under GDPR, data subjects have specific rights. Access, they can ask what you have on them. Rectification, they can correct errors. Erasure, the right to be forgotten. Article 17. Portability, they can take their data and leave. Objection, they can refuse certain processing. Restriction, they can pause processing while a dispute is resolved. If you have ever sat through a GDPR privacy training and thought the lawyer was making it up, they were not. These rights are real and the fines for ignoring them are bigger than the breach itself. One scenario the exam likes to test: the cloud-based payroll provider. Who is the controller and who is the processor? The company that hires the payroll provider is the controller. They decide why the payroll data exists and how it gets processed. The cloud provider is the processor. They execute the processing under the controller's instructions. The employees are the data subjects. The HR director is probably the data owner. The cloud provider's database administrator is the data custodian. 5 roles, 1 transaction. The exam will scramble the labels and ask you to match them. Practice this until it is automatic. One more piece: the difference between policy and standard at the edge. Consider this scenario. The information security policy says, quote, all systems must use strong authentication, unquote. That is policy. The associated standard says, quote, all systems must require a minimum of 12-character passwords with mixed case, numbers, and special characters, plus MFA for any administrative access, unquote. That is standard. The procedure says, quote, to enroll a user in MFA, do steps 1 through 9 in the IAM console, unquote. That is procedure. The guideline says, quote, employees should consider using a password manager such as the company approved tool, unquote. That is guideline. Same topic. 4 documents. 4 tiers. The exam will hand you any one of these phrases and ask which tier. Match the wording to the tier and the answer falls out. One more nuance for the exam. The SDLC policy versus the SDLC standard versus the SDLC procedure. The policy says the organization will integrate security into the software development lifecycle. The standard says specifically, code review required before merge, SAST scan required at build time, DAST scan required before release, dependency check required, secret scan required. The procedure says step by step how to run each of those scans, where the results go, and who approves the release. Same topic. 3 tiers. The exam will hand you a snippet and ask which one you are reading. Match the language of intent versus measurement versus instruction. And one fact most candidates skip: policies are reviewed and reapproved on a cycle. Annually for most organizations, whenever a major business change happens, whenever a regulation changes, the version history of the policy document is itself an audit artifact. Auditors check the last review date, they check the approval signature, they check whether the policy reflects the current organization or a version of the organization from 3 reorgs ago. A policy that has not been touched in 5 years is not a current policy. It is a historical document. Treat the review cadence as part of the policy itself. Insider tip on the data classification scheme. Most organizations have 4 to 5 tiers: public, internal, confidential, restricted, sometimes a 5th tier for regulated data like cardholder or PHI. The data owner decides which tier their data falls into. The data custodian implements the controls that the policy assigns to that tier. If you have ever sat through a data classification meeting, you have watched a business leader argue that their spreadsheet is critical national infrastructure, while the legal team rolls their eyes. The right answer for the exam is always: the owner classifies, the custodian protects, and the controls follow the classification. Quick recap as a checklist. 1. Know the 4-tier hierarchy: policy, standard, procedure, guideline. The first 3 are mandatory. The 4th is advisory. 2. AUP governs employee use of company assets. Sign at onboarding. Re-acknowledge annually. 3. Playbooks are procedures specific to incident response. When the exam says playbook, think procedure. 4. Frameworks ranked: NIST, CSF broad, ISO 27001 certifiable, CIS Controls prescriptive, COBIT audit heavy. 5. Regulatory beats internal policy. Always. 6. Data owner is a business leader and accountable. Data custodian is IT and responsible. 7. Under GDPR, controllers decide purpose. Processors execute and data subjects have 6 rights. 8. GDPR applies globally to any org processing EU residents' data. 9. The CAB is a governance structure for change management. 10. Guidelines say should. Everything else says shall. 11. Centralized governance is consistent but slow. Decentralized is flexible but inconsistent. 12. The board of directors sets risk appetite and tone at the top. That is Objective 5.1. Governance is the layer most engineers ignore until an auditor shows up or a breach happens, whichever comes first. Next up, Objective 5.2. Risk management. The math, the matrices, the registers, and the formulas the exam will absolutely test you on. See you there.